That is what happens when you try and control a storm. Oh, here we go. Hey guys, welcome to chapter 13 of the Castor Saga. If you're new here, we have 12 episodes before this, and I put them on a playlist for you, so go check them out. Spoiler alert, this is chapter 13. Chapter 13, The Forest of Trails. They entered the forest quietly, and immediately had to make a choice. The left trail, the middle trail, or the right trail. All the trails would lead out, but one trail had nothing to face, while the other two had an intermediate and an extremely difficult trial to face. They stepped up, and then looked at Meli. Which way, Meli? This isn't a trial I can do alone. We have to work together on this one. Help me pick, guys. Which way? They were all confused and slightly panicked when she said that, and all had looks of terror on their faces. Well, someone needs to pick. Let's take turns. You start, Meli. Meli nodded and closed her eyes, putting her hand out in front of herself. She directed her hand towards each path, then opened her eyes, taking a deep breath. Let's go right. They all nodded and began walking down the right path. Just when they thought they were in the clear, the tracks gave out below them, and they fell through the ground. They grabbed the vines around them and pulled themselves towards the top of the gaping hole. Below them were spikes, and they were all scared to fall in, but they climbed up away from the spikes and helped each other out of the hole. Then they continued down the path. They came to a two-way split in the path, and Rose chose the next direction for them. She chose left, and they didn't run into any obstacles. Jake picked the path after her, and when they came to the three-way split, they went down the middle path and ran into what seemed to be a wall of spikes. One wall closed in on them, pushing them against the second wall, but they used the spikes as steps and crawled over the top, then jumping down off the wall and again continuing on. They came to a four-way split, and this time Dawn picked. They chose the third path and walked down, running into a huge creature. It had 3 round heads and a large round body. It was a giant ogre-looking creature. It had horns like a goat, a tail like a lion, and appeared to have flames spurting from its nose. Dawn and Chrissy were standing the closest to it, and they flashed their eyes as it went to attack them. Dawn roundhouse kicked it away from the others, but it stood up and came back at them. Jake ran from farther away, and he jumped into the air, spinning as he kicked it, his eyes lighting up bright red. It just stood up and came at them again. Nothing seemed to stop it. Go, it's okay, we'll catch up. Meli paused, not wanting to leave them behind, but Tony and Luke pulled her away as they ran, picking other different paths to get through the trials. They marked each path that they took, so the others could get out and follow them. When they finally got out, they stood there for what seemed like hours, but the others never came out. They made a camp in the gated area outside the Forest of Trails, and sat there waiting for them, hoping they'd come out alive, but they never did. Meli sat staring into the fire in a great rage. Tony tried to talk to her, but she just lashed out at him. Meli, we shouldn't have left them, Tony. We could have helped. It was their choice to stay, Meli. They could have just ran, but they didn't. They made the choice to try and fight it. You can't fight everyone's battles for them. Meli glared at Luke, then stood and walked away from them, sitting farther down the tracks in the dark. Tony stood to walk over to her, but Luke shook his head. You might just want to leave her be for a while. She blames herself. John spoke up, but what he said made Tony angry. Well, it was kind of her fault. She probably could have saved them. Tony growled, and his eyes flashed purple as he stepped towards John. How dare you? Even if she could have done something, this is in no way her fault. How can you say that? Rose stood up between Tony and John and stopped Tony from getting any closer to him. Tony. Tony stared at her a moment. Then his eyes dimmed out, and he walked over beside Meli, sitting beside her down the tracks in the dark. She was writing in her journal when he came over and sat down. What you writing, Meli? Meli didn't say anything. She just kept scribbling down things in her journal. Tony sat there quietly a moment, then began to stand. Do you want to be alone? Meli grabbed him by the leg, forcing him to sit down beside her. She hugged him tightly, and he put his arms down around her, gently hugging her in return. We could have saved them. Then why didn't we? Meli was in tears, and as she cried, the open sky above them filled with dark clouds as rain began pouring down on them. I don't know. I could have saved them. I don't know why I let you pull me away. I don't know. Tony looked up, and standing down along the tracks was the dark-figured man. The same one he'd seen before. "Meli, look." Meli looked up and saw the man and gave him a dark, hellish look as her eyes flashed white. "Get away from us! Go away!" The shadow-like man vanished from the tracks as a bolt of lightning came down and struck him. Tony felt Meli shaking, but it wasn't because she was scared. It was because she was angry. "Shh, Meli, calm down." "Sometimes people can't calm down, Tony. Sometimes they need to yell and scream and just let loose. I'm so pissed right now. Ah!" Lightning struck all around them, and Tony clung tightly to her legs as she stood up, trying to control it. "Meli, stop." "I can't." A tornado encircled them as they stood in the middle of it. Everyone over by the fire was holding onto trees in the tracks for dear life. It was like hell had broken loose, and they were on the outer edge of it. Tony crawled to stand, holding on to Meli as he wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, as the tornado slowly settled down and the lightning quit striking the ground. Tony turned Meli to face him, and she looked into his eyes with tears streaming her own. He grabbed her and hugged her tightly, as she fell down onto her knees. He picked her up and walked back over to the others, who were shaken, but okay. John spoke, trying to figure out what was going on. "What was that?" "That is what happens when you try and control a storm." Tony laid Meli down against a log, then sat down himself. She clung to his arm, staying quiet and hiding her face from the others. Rose came over beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Meli. It wasn't your fault. It's okay." Meli didn't make a sound. She just hid her face in the hood of her cloak and stayed clinging tightly to Tony's arm. No one else said a word that night, as they all went to bed. The others all drifted off eventually, but Tony couldn't sleep. Meli was still clinging to him tightly. Finally, she said something. "Do you think I scared it away? Whatever that was, standing on the tracks?" Probably. Are you scared of it?" "No, just irritated he's following us now that I saw him with my own eyes. I've always kept my group of friends pretty small anyway, but I don't want him to hurt the others or cause us to lose anyone else in the forest. They've worked so hard to get to the end." "We've got their backs, Meli. We won't let anyone else get hurt. They'll be okay." Meli was quiet a moment, then spoke in a somber tone of voice. "That's Rule 14, you know." "What is?" "Keep your inner circle small. If you don't, you'll have no energy to care for yourself." "Good advice to receive. I think I've followed that one pretty well throughout my life." Meli nodded once and looked up at him with soft, tired eyes. "Do you think the others suffered?" "You mean Jake and the girls?" "Yeah." "I think, at least I hope, it was quick and painless." "Agreed." They didn't say anything more that night, and eventually they fell asleep like the others. The next morning was very tedious, picking stuff up that had been blown by the wind, but waking up was a little different. Tony woke up with his arm over Meli, and when he noticed it, he sat up and rubbed his head. He'd gotten a headache overnight, and really hoped the last forest would be calm and quiet today. He shook Meli gently awake, and she sat up looking around her. She sighed and counted her friends. There were 7 of them left from the original 40 or so. Meli was very disturbed by this. Her vision showed that only 6 of her friends would make it out, and she couldn't handle losing anyone else at this point. They were all tired and worn out from the various climates. They were almost out, but she could tell their hope was dwindling more and more as fewer people remained. They all stood up, and Meli decided everyone needed to practice before going into the final forest. Pushing them probably wasn't the best thing, but Meli needed to at least know what strength they had left, so she knew who needed more help. The final forest was the Forest of Mists. It wasn't the mist that was worrisome. The forest was supposed to have horrible creatures in it that would attack you and drag you off the tracks. Demons that dripped blood and thirsted for more constantly. Meli knew this, and told everyone they needed to practice. She walked around watching them, correcting stances and such. She wanted to make sure that everyone was perfect in their techniques before they entered the forest. She didn't seem as nonchalant today, and everyone was slightly worried about her. She was acting completely different, and Tony was the most worried. "Meli?" "Huh?" Are you thinking what I'm thinking? That there's 7 of us left?" "Yeah. Didn't you say 6? "I don't care what I said. We're all making it out of this place. I don't care what I saw. I must have been wrong." "You haven't been wrong yet. Well, I changed my mind. Maybe it meant 6 plus me, huh? Maybe, Mels. Just take a deep breath. I've got your back. Thanks, Tony. All right, everyone line up. I've got a drill for you. A drill? What kind of drill, Meli? I'm gonna test you. Test us on what? How quick you can escape and return fire when attacked. Oh. Yikes. Oh, come on, guys. I'm ready when you are, Meli. Meli smiled and nodded as they all stood in line in front of her. Meli tested each of them differently. Their goal was to escape and throw something back at Meli in a time-efficient manner. The creatures of the Forest of Mist were so quick that they often weren't even seen. Meli didn't tell them what order they were going in. She just walked around them and expected them to react as she attacked. But it was almost as if she'd done this before. The first one she attacked was John. She manipulated a vine in the trees and grabbed his ankles, yanking him off the tracks. But before he got close to the track edge, he sliced the vine, took control of it, and whipped it at Meli, wrapping it around her wrists. She smiled, and he dropped the vine, letting her go, as he stepped away from the group, having taken his turn. The next person she attacked was Eej. She put her hand above her head, then made a sharp motion towards the ground. Giant ice shards fell from the sky, caging him like a prisoner. But Eej took a deep breath and blew hot, mist-like steam from his nose, which melted the ice. He then vanished from the mist and appeared behind Meli, holding her wrists behind her back. She smiled as he let her go and nodded. Then he walked over by John. The next to be attacked was Luke. Meli knew they were almost to the ocean and Garden of Lily, so the dirt below their feet would be more like sand. Meli used this to her advantage as she manipulated the sand below him and turned it into quicksand. Luke smiled and allowed the sand to take him below. It was quiet for a moment, and everyone was slightly worried. Each spoke up, worried about their friend. Meli, is he? Meli put a hand up, smiling, saying that it was okay, and as she did that, Luke came up out of the ground below her and grabbed her by the feet. He came up completely and nodded to her, walking over by Eej and John. The next one to go was Rose. Meli walked over in front of Rose and smiled as roots from the trees below their feet began coming up out of the ground and lifting her up, locking her so she couldn't move. Rose remained calm, and her eyes lit up as she suddenly vanished, turning entirely invisible to their eyes. She'd gotten loose and came up behind Meli. She used her belt and tried to put Meli in a chokehold with it, but Meli stepped out from under it and nodded to Rose as she walked over by John. Keith and Tony were the only ones left now, and Meli had chosen Keith to be next. Meli made a motion, but nothing happened immediately. Keith looked around him, not seeing anything. Then suddenly, a ghostly-looking form rushed from Meli's body and started going after Keith as if it were some kind of screaming banshee. Keith pulled a fan from his bag and slashed through the ghostly figure. Then he spun around and flung the fan at Meli. She caught it and smiled as he walked over, and she folded it nicely, then giving it back to him. He nodded to her and walked over by the others. Now it was Tony's turn. Meli stood in front of him and smiled sweetly, but as she did, her energy transformed around her and gave her a transparent appearance of a white wolf with bright blue eyes. You could see her regular body within the energy form surrounding her, but the energy was obviously the form in charge right now. Everyone was absolutely stunned at first, and Meli circled Tony in her wolf form with her teeth bared. Tony smiled as his eyes lit up the purple color, and he slowly transformed into his purple-tinted Black Panther state, using the same exact technique that Meli was using. He growled at Meli, and when she jumped at him, he dodged her and pounced her, pinning her to the ground with one paw. She looked up at him and smiled, then let her wolf form fade back into her body. Tony copied her, letting his own spirit form fade. Then he smiled down at her confidently. He leaned in close to her ear and spoke softly to her. How was that? Meli smiled as she felt his breath against her ear and neck and brought her one hand up to touch his face as he released her hands from his own. Perfect. You're ready. Tony smiled in a very satisfied way and scooped her up in his arms as he stood up, pulling her with him in a single motion. Meli looked at him with a smirk, then walked over to the others with him. I think you're all ready. They smiled and bowed slightly. Then Rose stepped up smiling. Thank you for teaching us and helping us, Meli. You're welcome. They gathered their things and began walking towards the Forest of Mists. They wouldn't know exactly when they entered, because the area around the forest was also misty and foggy like the inside. They walked together, some nervous, some not, and Meli walked ahead of them. They followed her quietly, knowing that if they made it out of this forest, then they would walk out to an open grassy area next to the sea. This would be the Garden of Lily, and hopefully someone would be there to greet them and tell them what came next. The bad part was, They were still being followed. The shadowy creature man figure was following them and had been watching them the entire time. They stepped quietly, trying to avoid detection, not knowing if they were in the forest or outside of the forest still. It began to get foggy, and the longer they walked, the less they could see. Meli began counting, hoping that counting the steps would help her. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. What are you doing, Mels? Counting our steps so we have some idea of when we're in the forest. Meli, I think we're getting close. What makes you say that? Rose pointed ahead, and they all looked in front of them. A large beast-like creature was sitting just off the tracks, and appeared to be either asleep or unconscious. What is that? It looks like an ogre with the head of a bull and the body of a... I don't know. And what kind of creature exactly does it make it? I don't know, some sort of minotaur, I guess? Wait, why isn't it attacking us? Shh, boys. That is a bit strange, isn't it, Meli? Yeah, why isn't it attacking us? Perhaps it hasn't noticed us? After all the noise we've been making? Unlikely. Then maybe it's in a dormant state. Perhaps. Or maybe there's something worse nearby and it doesn't want to be noticed by it. Everyone looked around them frightened, but Tony and Meli slowly approached it as the others stood back watching. Tony looked at Meli, who nodded, then gestured to him as Tony reached over and poked the creature. Hello, sir? Are you okay? The creature didn't move an inch, and Meli grabbed Tony by the arm, pulling him to step aside with her. Maybe we should just leave him alone, huh? Yeah, he could just be sleeping, right? They all slowly moved past it, but after they moved past it, they turned to see if it had moved, and it was gone. Where'd he go? Do you think he could move the whole time and just spared us? Maybe. Why would it do that, though? I don't know. Maybe you were right. Maybe it was scared of something more dangerous than itself. Rose looked at Meli as she said that, with a slightly concerned expression, as Meli walked on, not thinking twice about what Rose had said. They hurried along the train tracks, getting more and more anxious when nothing came out around them. They were questioning if they were even close to the forest. Suddenly, all around them, the mist and fog began to thicken so that they couldn't see an inch in front of their faces. They held hands as they walked to keep from getting separated. After all, there was only 7 of them left, and Meli was determined to get them all out safely. They walked along the trail for what seemed like hours, until finally, one of them snapped from irritation. John spoke in an irritated-sounding voice. Okay, I'm getting annoyed now. Our nerves are shot, nothing's happening, and here we are finally prepared to fight, yet we seem to be going in circles. How could we be going in circles? We're going straight. The train tracks go straight, John. I know that, Rose, but I could have sworn we've passed that tree before. John pointed to a tree to the left of the tracks, and everyone looked at him like he was crazy. I'm telling ya, we're going in circles, guys. Rose rolled her eyes and decided to humor him and gave in to the idea. All right, if we're going in circles, then I'll drop a cloth here on the tracks. No, better yet, I'll tie it to the tracks. Now we'll know if we pass this spot again. She took a blue cloth out of her bag, wrapped it around one of the railroad ties, and tied it in a bow. There, see? Now let's keep moving. They all began walking again, but just as they turned to continue walking, the blue cloth somehow appeared in front of them, tied to the tracks. Rose went over to pick it up, but John beat her to it. He snatched it up and waved it in her face. See? I'm not crazy. We've been going in circles. But how? Meli spoke, trying to reassure them. It's the forest. It's trying to trick us. Everyone stay together. We have to keep our sanity, otherwise the forest will win. Obviously John needs to be tied to someone in case he loses it completely. Rose? Why me? Because if he goes insane and runs off the tracks, his partner's the only one responsible for him. Hey! Be quiet, John. All right. Rose smiled at John, who tried to smile back. He really didn't mind being tied to Rose. After all, she was his partner. Meli used Rose's cloth and tied their wrists together as they held hands. Now, come on. Anyone else need to be tied to someone? They all shook their heads, but then Tony nodded, making a joke. Well, apparently I'm already tied to you, so besides me, I think we're good. Meli and Rose both laughed, and Tony smiled, getting a bit of a confidence boost from their laughter. Meli grabbed his hand, as the others also all held hands, and they walked through the fog as if it were a normal day, as if they weren't casters, and as if they weren't almost to the Garden of Lily. And that concludes Chapter 13. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already, subscribe below, and until next time, I love you all very much. Bye.